The winter wind screamed through the broken skeleton of a dead city. Snow had buried everything: the cratered streets, the overturned vehicles, the rusted swing set in what used to be a park. 3 stories up, in a half-collapsed apartment building, a woman lay completely still in the dark, her cheek pressed against the wooden stock of a rifle that the younger soldiers behind her had already decided was a joke. They hadn't said it directly to her face. They never did. But she had heard the whispers the moment she walked into the staging area 2 nights ago. A lean woman in her late 30s, unremarkable coat, no visible rank insignia, carrying a bolt-action rifle with a scope that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Is that what we're working with?" one of them had muttered to another. "My grandfather had something like that. He used it to shoot deer." She had set the rifle down on the table, unzipped her pack, and started laying out her equipment without a word. Wind gauge, small notepad filled with handwritten calculations, a single box of ammunition, each round hand-loaded. 7 days later, 3 of the enemy's most powerful commanding generals would be dead, and every one of them would fall to a bullet fired from the rifle they had laughed at. The city had a name once. It appeared on maps, in postal codes, in the casual conversations of people who had lived there for generations. Now, it appeared only in intelligence briefings, classified as Sector 7, Bravo, and whatever name it had once carried felt dishonest, a label for something that no longer existed in the form the label had been made for. What remained was architecture in the process of forgetting what it had been. Factory towers with their windows blown out stood like broken teeth against a white sky. The residential blocks along the Eastern Avenue had taken artillery in September, and their facades had peeled away to reveal the cross-sections of lives. Wallpaper still clinging to exposed rooms. A child's bicycle, suspended on a slab of concrete 3 stories above the street, a kitchen calendar frozen on a month that no longer mattered. Snow had come in November and had not stopped. It softened everything. It made the wreckage look almost peaceful, the way a sheet drawn over a body makes death look almost like sleep. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reeves had been in the city for 11 days when the woman arrived. He commanded a 6-person fire team tasked with what the briefing documents called area security, a bureaucratic phrase that meant they moved from building to building in the dark, avoided the open ground where drone coverage was consistent, ate cold rations, and waited for orders that usually came too late to be useful. He had not been told much about the woman, only that her call sign was White Ghost, that she operated independently, and that his team was to provide support and concealment for a period not to exceed 10 days. When he asked his commanding officer what the mission objective was, the CO had said, "She'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it." That answer had not sat well with any of them, especially not with Private First Class Tyler Marsh, 22 years old, 6 months in country, and already carrying the kind of confidence that young men develop when they have survived long enough to believe they understand something, but not long enough to know how little they understand. Marsh was the one who had made the grandfather and deer hunting comment. He had also spent considerable energy on the first night explaining to Corporal Adele Fontaine that the woman's rifle was a variant of a Cold War-era design, essentially obsolete, and that any serious long-range shooter in the current operational environment would be using one of the modern precision platforms the unit was equipped with. Fontaine had listened, nodded, and said nothing. She was 26, and she had already learned the particular wisdom of saying nothing. The woman, none of them knew her real name, and she had not offered it occupied a corner of the 3rd floor that she had selected herself, moving through the building on arrival with a deliberateness that Reeves found unsettling. She tested floorboards. She measured angles through empty window frames with a small device he didn't recognize. She lay down in several positions before she found the one she wanted, and then she placed her pack down, unrolled a thin foam mat, and lay on it in the dark without speaking. The rifle rested beside her. Even in the low light of a winter afternoon filtered through dust and broken concrete, it was clearly old. The stock was wood, worn smooth at the grip, darkened with years of contact with human hands. The barrel was long. The scope was fixed, not variable, a design philosophy that had gone out of fashion before most of the soldiers in the room had been born. Reeves sat near her for a while, saying nothing, and eventually he asked, "What are we waiting for?" She turned her head slightly. Her eyes were gray, or possibly green, the light made it difficult to tell. She looked at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was also not the expression of someone who intended to have a long conversation. 3 targets, she said. 7 days, that's the window. He waited for more. She didn't offer it. He nodded slowly and moved back to his team. The city groaned around them in the wind. Somewhere in the eastern blocks, a section of wall gave way with a sound like a slow exhale. Snow ticked against the broken glass. The night came down hard and early, the way it does in winter at that latitude, and the temperature dropped to something that made breathing feel like an act of will. White Ghost lay on her mat and watched the darkness through the window frame, and she did not sleep. The second morning, Marsh decided to try a more direct approach. He waited until the woman was field stripping the rifle, a process she performed with the unhurried precision of someone doing something they had done thousands of times, each motion identical to the last, and he crouched beside her. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," he said, which was almost certainly not true, "but I'm curious about the platform choice. We have 2 M110s in the team. Effective range over 800 meters, semi-automatic, suppressors. Why bring that?" He gestured at the rifle, now in pieces on a clean cloth in front of her. She picked up the barrel and held it up, examining the bore against the pale light from the window. She was looking for something, a fouling pattern, a wear mark, something only she could read. She set it down and picked up the bolt assembly. "Those are good rifles," she said. "So why not?" "I didn't say they weren't good. I said they were good." Marsh paused. "So what's the difference?" She set the bolt down. She looked at him directly for the first time since he had started talking, and the quality of that look made him feel, briefly, like he was being measured for something and coming up short. "A semi-automatic gives you a second shot before the first has finished telling you what it needs to tell you," she said. "I don't take second shots." He stared at her. She turned back to the rifle. Later, he repeated the exchange to Fontaine, who thought about it for a moment, and then said, "She means she doesn't miss." Marsh laughed at that, but it was the kind of laugh that is mostly a cover for something else. The rifle, as Fontaine would later learn in pieces over the following days, had a history. It was not the standard issue version of its design. It had been modified over many years by a woman named Eleanor Briggs, a long-range shooter who had served in a conflict 2 decades earlier and who had, by the end of her service, held 2 confirmed kills at ranges that had never officially been matched. Briggs had spent years after the war modifying the rifle by hand, rebarreling, fitting a custom trigger group, reworking the bedding between barrel and stock until the relationship between the two was as precise as anything produced in a factory. The scope was period appropriate but had been internally rebuilt with modern glass. Eleanor Briggs had died 8 years ago. Not in combat. In a hospital, quietly, from something ordinary and unheroic, the way most extraordinary people end. The woman called White Ghost had been her last student. None of the soldiers knew this yet. They would learn it gradually, the way you learn most true things, not through announcement, but through accumulation, one small piece at a time until the picture becomes impossible to avoid seeing. On the second afternoon, she reassembled the rifle in the dark in under 4 minutes without looking at her hands. Marsh watched from across the room and said nothing. That night, she made small adjustments to her shooting position, millimeter corrections to the angle of the bipod, a slight change in how her shoulder met the stock, and she recorded them in the notepad. She made calculations based on the wind gauge readings she had been taking every 2 hours since arrival. She noted the temperature differential between her position and the estimated position of her targets. She noted the altitude. She noted the specific characteristics of the ammunition she was using, which she had loaded herself from components she had brought in a separate case. When Reeves looked over her shoulder at the notepad, the pages were filled with numbers and abbreviated notations that meant nothing to him. He recognized the format of a ballistic table, but the inputs were more complex than anything he had seen, filled with variables he could not identify. "How far?" he asked. She glanced at the page. "First target, 1,400 meters, give or take. Depends on where he positions himself in the building. 1,400 meters. Reeves had shot at 700 meters and missed. He said nothing and walked back to his post. The wind came up that night and rattled the building, and somewhere far to the east, artillery lit the horizon in brief orange pulses, like the slow heartbeat of something dying. The first general arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. His name was in the intelligence briefing that Reeves received via encrypted channel, a senior field commander, 22 years of service, responsible for the operational planning of the city's occupation. He traveled with a security detail of 12, 3 armored vehicles, and a communications truck. He was not a man accustomed to thinking of himself as vulnerable. The city had been under his force's control for 4 months. The sniper threat had been assessed as low. His security protocols were thorough but not obsessive, the way security protocols become when the people designing them believe, somewhere beneath the professional caution, that the threat is mostly theoretical. He was wrong about that. White Ghost had been watching the building designated as the command post for 2 days. She knew which windows faced which direction. She had tracked the movements of the security personnel through her scope, not to shoot them, but to understand the rhythms of the place. She noted when the guards changed. She noted which windows were used for communication and which were used for observation. She noted the heating exhaust from the east side of the building, which told her where the meeting room was. On the morning the general arrived, she told Reeves to move the team 2 floors down and to the north side of the building. "Why?" he asked. "Because when I take the shot, they'll vector on this floor. I want you away from that." He moved the team. He did not ask any more questions. At 11:14 inches the morning, a storm front arrived from the northwest. The snow came in hard and sideways, cutting visibility to less than 200 meters at street level. In the building behind Reeves, he could hear his team's voices drop to near silence as the storm descended, the way people instinctively quiet themselves in the presence of large natural forces. Marsh said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She can't shoot in this." Fontaine said nothing. At 11:31, a single shot cut through the howling of the storm. It was not loud, the wind ate most of the sound, but in the quality of the silence that followed, something had changed. Reeves felt it in his chest before he processed it with his mind. A resonance. The particular stillness that comes after something irreversible has happened. 2 floors up, White Ghost was already moving. She had the rifle broken down in 30 seconds, packaged in 40. She was out of the position in under 2 minutes, moving through the building along a route she had memorized on the first day, descending through a back staircase that the security teams wouldn't reach for another 7 minutes. She met the team in the basement. Reeves looked at her. She looked back. Her face was the same as always, composed, watchful, giving nothing away. "1," she said. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. It was Fontaine who eventually spoke, quietly, half to herself. 1,400 meters. In a storm. White Ghost was already studying the building schematics for their next position. She did not respond. But the corner of her mouth moved, barely, in something that might have been acknowledgement. The enemy's radio traffic, intercepted by a signals unit 20 kilometers to the south, exploded into controlled chaos over the next 2 hours. The general was dead before he hit the floor of the conference room. The window he had been sitting beside, a small gap between a board and the frame, barely large enough to matter, had been the entrance point. The exit had made identification of the shooting position nearly impossible in the storm conditions. The security details swept the city block by block. They found nothing. They found no one. They found, in the snow on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, 1,420 meters from the command post, a small rectangular depression in the dust where a bipod had rested. Nothing else. The ghost was already gone. The response was immediate and thorough. Within 6 hours of the general's death, the enemy had tripled the patrol density in the central sectors. Drone coverage, previously limited to 12 hours per day, became continuous. Counter-sniper teams, 2-person units equipped with thermal imaging and suppressed precision rifles, were deployed to 17 positions throughout the city. All movement between buildings was suspended for 48 hours. The command post was relocated to a reinforced basement that had no exterior windows. It was a professional response. Whoever had designed it understood the threat they were dealing with. Reeves pulled his team back to a safe building in the northern industrial quarter and spent an uncomfortable 12 hours waiting. The drone above them passed every 40 minutes. The thermal signatures from the building's 6 bodies, breathing, radiating heat, would read as civilians sheltering, which was common enough in the occupied zones to not trigger an immediate response. Probably. The margin of error was not comfortable. Marsh, in the long hours of waiting, had gone quiet in a different way than usual. He sat near the window away from it, not visible, but close enough to watch the street, and he said almost nothing. Fontaine watched him from across the room and understood what was happening. The shift. She had seen it in others and had gone through her own version of it. The moment when the abstract understanding that you are operating near something genuinely dangerous becomes a physical, animal knowledge. The body knows before the mind admits it. On the second day of the lockdown, Private Second Class Grayson Webb came to sit near White Ghost. He was the youngest in the team, 19, sandy-haired, from somewhere flat in the Midwest. He had said almost nothing since her arrival. He watched her with the focused attention of someone trying to learn something they don't yet have words for. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "That they know someone is here now?" She was reading her notepad. She turned a page without looking up. They knew someone might be here. Now they know someone is here. That's useful information for both sides. How is it useful for us? She set the notepad down. She looked at him. Because now I know how they respond. I know their counter-sniper doctrine. I know how long they take to reposition. I know which buildings they prioritize. Webb processed this. You wanted them to respond. She picked up the notepad again. I needed to know how they would respond. There's a difference. Reeves, listening from across the room, felt the fine hairs on his arms stand up. Not from fear, exactly. From recognition. He had worked with good operators before. He had never worked with anyone who thought the way this woman thought 3 moves ahead, reading the situation the way a chess player reads a board, except the board was a dead city in a blizzard, and the pieces were people. On the evening of the second day, a signals intercept confirmed that the second general who had been scheduled to arrive after the first had moved up his timeline. He would be in the city within 48 hours. The threat assessment conducted by his security team had apparently concluded that the sniper was a one-time asset, now either extracted or frozen. They had underestimated the patience of cold. 2 days, Reeves told her. She nodded. She was already making calculations. Outside, the drone circled. The counter-sniper teams moved through buildings that were empty and cold. The snow kept falling. The counter-sniper found them on the morning of the 3rd day after the first kill. Not through the drones. Not through thermal imaging. Through patience, the same quality that White Ghost had in abundance, now arrayed against her. The enemy shooter had identified the probable extraction route from the first shooting position and had backtracked the geometry, identifying 3 buildings from which a shot at that angle and distance was theoretically possible. He had set up in one of them and waited. It was Corporal Adele Fontaine who spotted the first sign. A reflection, half a second, barely registering from the 3rd floor of a building that should have been unoccupied. She reported it quietly, without urgency. The way you do when urgency is the enemy of accuracy. White Ghost went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. She was already still. But now the quality of it changed. It became the stillness of something that is processing information very quickly, while producing no outward movement at all. "Position?" she asked. Fontaine described the building, the floor, the approximate window. White Ghost began making small adjustments to her position. Not major movements, fractions of inches. She was not acquiring the target. She was presenting as little observable surface as possible while repositioning her scope's field of view to cover the indicated building. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Webb moved a minor adjustment of his weight, shifting slightly, a completely involuntary response to the cold that had settled into his left hip. The motion was small, maybe 8 inches of movement against a dark background. It was enough. The shot came through the window frame and hit Webb in the left shoulder, spinning him backward. He didn't make a sound. The shock came before the pain, and he was down before anyone had processed what had happened. Fontaine was already moving to him, hand pressed to the entry point, her voice low and controlled as she told him to stay still. Marsh had his rifle up, pointing at the building, but there was nothing to shoot at, no visible target. The enemy shooter had fired and gone back behind cover in the same motion. Clean, professional, the work of someone who was very good at what they did. Reeves turned to look at White Ghost. She had not moved during any of this. She was in exactly the same position, her eye to the scope, her breathing slow and controlled, her right hand resting on the stock without gripping it. She was waiting. Reeves understood. The enemy shooter had fired one round. He would be waiting to see if it had achieved its objective, if the target was down, if there was panic, if someone would expose themselves to help. It was the second shot that killed people in these situations. The first shot created the chaos. The second shot used it. The team was not creating chaos. Fontaine worked on Webb in silence. Marsh held his position. Reeves stayed back from the window. White Ghost was a statue. 40 seconds passed. In the building across the street in North, the enemy shooter made a decision. He shifted slightly to improve his angle, assessing whether the first shot had connected. The scope glass caught the winter light for 0.3 seconds. White Ghost fired. One shot. Bolt cycled and rechambered immediately, out of habit, out of discipline, but the second round was never needed. The reflection from across the street did not reappear. There was no further movement in the building. She stepped back from the window and began breaking down the rifle. Webb needs evacuation, Fontaine said. The shoulder is through and through. He can walk, but he needs a surgeon within. 12 hours, Webb said. His voice was strained but coherent. I know the standard. Reeves got on the encrypted channel and arranged for extraction from the northern perimeter. While they waited, he looked at White Ghost, who was reassembling the rifle in the dark. That shot, he said. How long did you wait for it? She looked up briefly. As long as it took. He nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that for her, time worked differently. She did not experience waiting the way the rest of them did as absence, as frustration, as the gap between where you are and where you need to be. For her, waiting was part of the work. It was not a gap, it was the thing itself. After Webb left with the extraction team, the remaining 4 of them held position through the night. Nobody slept. The drones flew their routes above. The snow ticked against the glass. In the silence, something had shifted in the way the team moved around her. Something in their posture, in their voices when they spoke to her. A recalibration, not quite reverence. Something more practical than that. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of a category of person that most of them had not encountered before and would likely not encounter again. The second general was a different kind of problem. His name did not appear in the briefing document. He was referenced only by his operational designation, the commander of the enemy's Western Territorial Forces, a man who had spent the last 18 months consolidating control over 4 occupied cities and who was, by multiple intelligence assessments, the most effective operational mind on the enemy's senior staff. His presence in the sector was the kind of event that had prompted the original mission tasking. He was also, clearly, a man who had read the after-action report on his colleague's death and had drawn intelligent conclusions from it. He never appeared in a window. He never crossed an open space between buildings. He moved by vehicle exclusively, and the vehicles were armored to a specification that made conventional anti-material engagement difficult without specialized equipment. His route through the city changed each time. His schedule, as far as intelligence could determine, was deliberately irregular. The morning after Webb's evacuation, Reeves sat beside White Ghost while she reviewed everything they had on the second general's movement patterns. She had been doing this for 2 hours, not reading so much as staring, the way people stare at something that is not yet resolved into a pattern but is about to be. There, she said finally, pointing to a line in the logistics data. He has a meeting in the Eastern Command node every 3rd day. Same time, 2-hour window. His route changes each time, Reeves said. The route changes. The destination doesn't. And there are only 4 streets wide enough for his vehicle configuration between the western entry point and the eastern node. She pulled out the city map she had annotated over the previous days. She placed 4 marks on it. One of these 4 streets. He has to use one of them. The timing gives me a 7-minute window per street. Reeves did the math. 4 possible streets, 7 minutes each. 28 minutes of total exposure for a 2-hour movement window. And the vehicle was armored. The glass on those vehicles, he said. It's rated to... I know what it's rated to. She opened the ammunition case. The rounds inside were different from the ones she had used on the first general, longer, heavier, with a different profile. Penetrator rounds, she said, before he could ask. Hand-loaded, higher chamber pressure than standard. I've been testing this load for 3 years. I know exactly what it does to laminated ballistic glass at 200 meters. He looked at the rounds. He looked at her. He decided to stop asking questions about the technical aspects of her preparation. On the 5th day, at a few minutes past 2 in the afternoon, White Ghost was in a position she had identified the previous night, a damaged warehouse on the edge of the Eastern District, 2nd floor, an opening in the wall where a loading bay door had been ripped away by an explosion months ago. The position was not ideal. It was exposed on 2 sides and required her to be in place for the full 28-minute window, which was a long time to hold still in below-zero temperatures with no structural cover. She had been there since midnight. She had not moved. The 2nd General's convoy appeared on the 4th of the 4 possible streets at 2:11 inches the afternoon. 3 vehicles, moving at approximately 40 kilometers per hour faster than normal traffic for the conditions, but not so fast as to suggest panic. The General was in the 2nd vehicle. She had identified this from the antenna configuration on the communications equipment visible through the rear window. She did not rush. She tracked the vehicle through the scope, accounting for the speed, the angle of approach, the crosswind that had come up in the last 30 minutes. She had already calculated the deflection at this range under these wind conditions. She made one last adjustment a fraction of a degree, and she waited for the geometry to align. The precise moment when the angle from her position to the vehicle's rear seat was perpendicular to the vehicle's armored side glass. 1 second. 2. She fired. The penetrator round covered the distance in just over a quarter of a second. It passed through the outer layer of laminate, through the inner pane, and through the seat where the General was sitting. The convoy did not stop immediately. The drivers, by training, accelerated and drove toward the designated safe point. It was only when they arrived and opened the rear door that they understood what had happened. White Ghost was already 3 blocks away by then, moving through the ruins in the snow, unhurried, carrying the rifle in its case. Fontaine, watching from the extraction point, said nothing when she arrived. She simply nodded. Reeves, on the radio with the command element, was receiving congratulatory traffic that he did not pass on. She would not have wanted to hear it. Marsh sat in the corner and stared at the floor for a long time. Whatever he had believed when he arrived in this city, he was revising it. That night, huddled in a deep interior room with no exterior walls, the safest geometry available in a building that was mostly structural compromise, Fontaine asked. It was not a direct question. She said, "The rifle, how long have you had it?" White Ghost was cleaning the barrel. She ran the patch through twice, examined it, ran it through again. 8 years. It was someone else's first. It was not a question, either. White Ghost paused with the cleaning rod extended and looked at Fontaine with something in her expression that was neither hostility nor openness, a careful neutrality, as if she was deciding. Then she set the cleaning rod down and told them. Eleanor Briggs had been a master sergeant in a conflict that most of the current team had been children during. She had been, according to the declassified records that existed, and the unclassified stories that had circulated among long-range shooters for years afterward, the most gifted natural marksman any of her instructors had encountered, not because of vision or coordination, though both were exceptional, but because of patience, because of the capacity to be still, to wait, to slow the internal clock to something approaching geological time while staying absolutely alert. It was a talent so rare that most shooting programs didn't bother trying to teach it, because it seemed unteachable, something you either had or you didn't. Eleanor Briggs had it, and she had spent her post-service career trying to understand whether it could be transmitted. She had tried with 11 students over 18 years. 10 of them had become excellent shooters. None of them had become Eleanor Briggs. The 11th had been the woman now sitting in a ruined building in the middle of a winter campaign, cleaning a rifle by feel in near total darkness. She did not explain this in those terms. She gave facts. That she had trained with Briggs for 4 years, starting when she was 21. That Briggs had modified the rifle over those years to suit her, adjusting the trigger pull, refitting the stock, rebalancing the weight. That when Briggs died, there had been no question of what would happen to the rifle. "She left it to you," Reeves said. "She left me to carry it. There's a difference." Marsh, who had been listening from the other side of the room, said, "What's the difference?" She picked the cleaning rod back up. "Ownership ends when you do. Carrying is something you do for as long as the thing needs to be carried." Silence. The building settled in the cold, small sounds of contraction and stress. Somewhere above them, something metallic shifted in the wind. "The shot Briggs held the record for," Fontaine said carefully. "How far?" White Ghost ran the next patch through the barrel. 1,940 meters. Confirmed. There were 2 others at longer distances that weren't submitted for official record. Why not? She didn't care about the record. She cared about the result. Fontaine considered this. She looked at the rifle, now reassembled, resting on its case in the corner. In the low light, the wood of the stock was the color of old honey, dark where the grip had worn it, lighter at the edges. It did not look like a museum piece anymore. It looked like something that had been used very thoroughly over a very long time for a very specific purpose. It looked like an extension of something rather than a thing in itself. Marsh got up quietly, crossed the room, and sat down closer to the group. He didn't say anything, but he had moved closer, and that said something. The 3rd general was the most senior of the 3. He was also, by nature and by experience, the most cautious. He had received the news of the other 2 deaths within hours of each arriving, and had spent the intervening days conducting what amounted to a personal audit of his own security arrangements. He had changed his accommodation 3 times. He had dismissed the standard security protocol and written his own, drilling his personal detail until they functioned as an integrated system rather than a collection of individuals. He moved less than either of the others had. When he moved, he did so with maximum concealment and minimum predictability. He was, in short, a serious man taking a serious threat seriously, and for 6 days, it had worked. He was still alive. On the morning of the 7th day, a weather system arrived that no one had predicted with precision, a deep low-pressure formation that descended from the north and brought with it conditions that grounded every drone in the sector, forced all mobile patrols inside, reduced visibility to approximately 50 meters at street level, and dropped the temperature to a point where exposed metal became dangerous to touch. The enemy security detail assessed the conditions as favorable. The threat was a long-range shooter. Long-range shooting required visibility. No visibility, no threat. They maintained their standard interior protocols, which were thorough, but they relaxed the exterior cordon. In those conditions, the cost-benefit calculation favored keeping people inside and alive over maintaining a perimeter that no one could use. This was a reasonable assessment. It was, under ordinary circumstances, the correct one. Reeves received the weather data at 0600 and brought it to White Ghost immediately. She had already been awake for he suspected most of the night. She looked at the weather summary. She looked at her notes. She looked at the city map. "I need the radio tower in Sector 4, she said. He pulled up the map. The radio tower was a steel lattice structure on the roof of a 6-story building in the commercial district. It was exposed. It was, in this weather, incredibly exposed 80 feet of open steel framework in a full storm. Nothing to break the wind. Ambient temperature well below 0. That's he started. The only structure in the sector with both the elevation and the sight line to the northeast quadrant of the command building. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. He's going to be at the command building? The storm kills the drones. The storm kills the exterior patrols. He's been inside for 6 days. He has a meeting he's been delaying because of us. Today, in this weather, he will believe he's protected. She looked at him. He is not protected from this. She touched the rifle case. Reeves thought about 14 reasons why this was inadvisable. He could see 12 of them clearly. He expressed none of them. He had been in this city for 7 days with this woman, and he had arrived at a conclusion that was simple and not particularly comfortable. She was right about things he did not have the framework to evaluate, and arguing with her was a tax on time that neither of them had. "We get you there and back?" he asked. "Yes, but only 3 of you. Anyone extra increases the exposure profile." He put the team at 3 himself, Fontaine and Marsh, who had become, in the past 2 days, someone he trusted, and they moved out into the storm. Moving through the city in those conditions was unlike anything Reeves had experienced. The snow was horizontal. Vision was reduced to the few feet immediately in front of you. Navigation was by memorized route and compass, the landmarks invisible, the streets indistinguishable from each other under a uniform coating of white. The cold was a physical force, pressing against exposed skin, reaching through layers, taking the dexterity from fingers that needed to be dexterous. White Ghost moved through it as if the weather were a minor inconvenience. She navigated without hesitation, adjusting course twice for reasons that Reeves could not identify, probably drone routes that remained active, probably counter-sniper teams that had not fully stood down. He followed her and stopped asking himself why he trusted her judgment on such things. They reached the building at 0840. The tower access was a locked hatch at the roof level. She had a key, a physical key, which she had obtained by methods she did not explain. The hatch opened. The wind hit them like a wall. She went up into the tower framework and the storm swallowed her. Below, the three of them held the building, watching the approaches, trying not to calculate how exposed they were. In the tower, there was only the storm. The steel lattice was encased in ice. The wind velocity at that height exceeded anything the gauge could measure precisely. She estimated it at 60 kilometers per hour, with gusts significantly higher. The temperature with wind chill was at the lower threshold of safe human exposure for unprotected tissue. Her fingers, in thin gloves chosen for feel over warmth, were at the margin of functional dexterity. She had been in worse. Not often. But the memory of worse served as a reference point, a baseline that made the current conditions merely extreme rather than impossible. She found a position in the lattice 40 feet above the roofline, wedged into a junction of the steel frame where she could brace herself against the wind without being fully rigid. Rigidity was dangerous in a storm. You had to allow for the structure's movement, which was continuous and significant. She was, in effect, part of the tower now. Her body moved with it when the gusts came. Her position relative to the target remained stable, because she was stable relative to the structure, and the structure's oscillation was slow enough to track. She set the rifle. She looked through the scope. The command building was 2,130 meters away. In the storm conditions, she could see approximately 60% of the structure. The rest was obscured by snow and distance. The specific location she needed a service entrance on the northeast face, used for vehicle access, was intermittently visible, clearing to 40% resolution for 2 to 4 seconds between snow curtains, and then disappearing again for 15 to 20 seconds. She was going to have to fire through the storm. This was, technically speaking, beyond the standard parameters of what was considered achievable long-range shooting. The crosswind deflection at this range and under these conditions was not a number that appeared in published ballistic tables. She had calculated it herself, using wind speed estimates that were educated guesses at best, applied to a mathematical model she had developed over 20 years of shooting in difficult conditions. The calculation had a margin of error of plus or minus 11 centimeters. She needed to hit a target approximately 30 centimeters across. She waited. The waiting was different up here. It had no floor or ceiling. The wind removed the sensation of time passing in any normal sense. She was simply present in the framework, in the storm, in the scope, and the waiting was not experienced as duration, but as a quality of attention, sustained and total. The intercepts had said the general had a meeting scheduled. The meeting would be attended on foot. The vehicle approach was too exposed in storm conditions. He would walk from the sheltered interior to the service entrance, where transport was waiting. 17 minutes after she had achieved her position, the service entrance opened. She saw a figure emerge, dark coat, 2 security personnel flanking, moving quickly toward the vehicle. The figure was in the clear for 4 seconds before the next snow curtain would obscure everything. She had one window. She breathed out. Half. Held. The shot. The bullet left the muzzle and entered the storm. At 2,100 meters in those conditions, the flight time was just over 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the wind affected it in ways that were partly calculated and partly acknowledged uncertainty. The penetrator round, heavier than standard, was less affected by crosswind than lighter designs. The calculation had accounted for the gust pattern she had observed over the previous 17 minutes. 3 seconds. The figure at the service entrance dropped. The security detail reacted immediately, covering and moving, scanning for the direction of the shot. The wind had scattered the sound. They looked east. The shot had come from the northwest. In the storm, in the confusion, they had 4 seconds to identify a threat before the weather made everything impossible again. They did not identify the source. The storm had already covered the angle, and the woman in the tower framework was already breaking down the rifle, moving by touch in a wind that wanted to tear her from the steel. She descended. She emerged from the hatch onto the roof and stood in the full violence of the storm for a moment, facing north. Her face was scoured by ice crystals. The cold had taken the sensation from her cheekbones and her fingers. She zipped the rifle case. She turned south. She went back down into the building. Reeves was waiting at the base of the stairs. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Done," she said. He exhaled. It was the first deep breath he had taken in 17 minutes. Fontaine pressed her hands briefly, the gesture of a person who understands cold and is checking for damage. White Ghost allowed this. She flexed her fingers. They were functional. Borderline, but functional. Marsh stood back. His face, for the first time since she had arrived, was completely open. No performance, no posturing, no protective irony. He looked at her the way you look at something when you understand you will not see its like again. She did not acknowledge this. She put the rifle case over her shoulder and said, "We need to move. They'll be expanding the search perimeter within 20 minutes. They moved. The extraction from the city took 11 hours. The storm had complicated everything. Movement, navigation, the encrypted communications relay that required line of sight to function. They moved in stages, building to building, using the weather as cover for the same reason the enemy had believed it made them safe. The irony of this was not lost on Reeves. They crossed the northern perimeter at 2,300 and were met by a 4-vehicle convoy that had been waiting for 3 hours. A field medic checked them over. Reeves had 2 fingers with mild frostbite. Fontaine had a badly bruised knee from a fall on the ice that she had not mentioned during the operation. Marsh was physically unharmed but would not sleep for 2 days, though he did not know that yet. White Ghost submitted to the medic's examination without comment. Her fingers and ears showed cold injury, but nothing requiring treatment beyond warming. She ate, drank water, and said nothing during the 2-hour vehicle transit to the forward operating base. At the FOB, she was met by a personnel officer, a major named Harrison, a methodical man in his 50s, with the organized calm of someone who had processed a great deal of unusual information over a long career. He took her aside for a debrief that lasted 40 minutes, after which he spent some time reviewing documents that had apparently accompanied her file. Reeves was filing his own after-action report in an adjacent room when he became aware of the quality of silence coming from Harrison's office. It was not the normal silence of document review. It had a different texture, the silence of someone who has encountered something unexpected. Harrison appeared in the doorway. His face was composed, but only technically around the eyes. In the set of his jaw, there was something that looked like recalibration. "Can I ask you something?" Reeves said. Harrison looked at him for a moment. "How much do you know about White Ghost's service history?" "Nothing official. She told us about her trainer, Eleanor Briggs." Harrison turned the file folder over in his hands. He looked at the front of it, whatever designation was printed there, and then at Reeves. "Eleanor Briggs," he said carefully, "died 8 years ago. Before that, she held 2 confirmed records for long-range engagement that have never officially been matched. Her training record listed 1 student who demonstrated, according to the documentation, performance indicators beyond assessment parameters." "That's her," Reeves said. "White Ghost." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "The issue," he said, "is the service record. Her official service record indicates that she was killed in action, approximately 9 years ago, in a different theater." Reeves stared at him. "Killed in action. Missing in action. Officially, presumed killed. The body was never recovered. The file was closed." The room was very quiet. Outside, through a small high window, snow was still falling lighter now, the storm easing, the sky beginning to separate from the land at the distant horizon. "Who else saw her file?" Reeves asked. "Currently? You and I. And the 3 generals she are dead." "Yes." Reeves thought about the rifle, the worn wood, the scope rebuilt with modern glass, the box of hand-loaded ammunition, the calculation notebooks filled with 20 years of conditions and adjustments and results. He thought about what she had said about the rifle, not ownership, carrying. He thought about Briggs, who had looked at this woman at 21 years old and seen something that 11 other students had not had, and had spent 4 years trying to transmit whatever it was she carried. He thought about what it meant that Briggs's record had never officially been matched, and he thought about a shot at 2,100 meters through a full storm, with a margin of error that would have required everything she had learned and perhaps something she had been born with. "She said the rifle needs to be carried," he said quietly. "As long as it needs to be carried." Harrison set the file folder down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed it and put it in the stack of documents marked for secure filing. "I think," he said, in the careful voice of a man who has decided what he believes without intending to say all of it, "that some things function better without a complete official record." He left the room. Reeves sat with the file for a while, not reading it, thinking about the city they had come from, the dead streets, the snow-covered wreckage, the windows like empty eye sockets and collapsed walls, thinking about a figure in a steel tower in a blizzard, braced against the wind, looking through a scope at something 2,100 meters away through curtains of snow, thinking about a shot that the mathematics said was possible and the reality said was barely, thinking about a woman who had been declared dead by the documents and had simply continued. In the adjacent room, he could hear the team debriefing. Fontaine's voice, measured and precise. Marsh's voice different now, quieter, the performance stripped away. The small sounds of people processing what they had been part of. White Ghost was not in either room. He had not seen her leave. He did not know where she had gone, or when, or if she would return. He suspected that was exactly how it was supposed to be. The rifle had been carried. The work had been done. The snow was still falling on the dead city, and the world was already in the process of forgetting that anyone had been there at all. Only the numbers remained. 7 days. 3 generals. 1 rifle. Distances that no one who hadn't witnessed them would entirely believe. And somewhere in the snow, moving through the world that had declared her a ghost and found her to be exactly right, a woman with a worn wooden stock over her shoulder was already calculating the next window, the next distance, the next patient interval of waiting that was not absence but the work itself. The legend of the White Ghost would circulate in the years that followed among people who spoke carefully and only in private intelligence officers who had reviewed the records, signals analysts who had tracked the radio traffic before and after, the handful of soldiers who had been in that city and who had told the story to no one because they understood, without being told, that the story was not theirs to tell. It would be told in numbers, ranges, days, targets, because numbers were the only language that could carry what had happened without reducing it. 2,100 meters. Through a storm. From a structure that should have been impossible. With a rifle that was older than most of the soldiers it had protected. In 7 days, by a woman who had, according to the official record, already been dead for 9 years. The old rifle had not been wrong to survive so long. It had simply been waiting, as all things wait, for the right conditions, for the right hands, for the moment when the work it was made for would be exactly and entirely necessary. And in the silence that followed the storm, in the dead city where the snow covered everything with the same patient, impersonal white, that moment passed into history the way all legendary things eventually do, quietly, completely, and without anyone watching. The ghost was gone. The work was done.